Dr. Karin Kettenring is the head of Wetland Ecology and Restoration Lab in the Department of Watershed Sciences at Utah State University. She has a BA in biology from Oberlin College. She received her Ph.D. in applied plant sciences from the University of Minnesota. Her PhD research focused on the restoration of sedges in prairie pothole wetlands. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Maryland, where she studied the invasion of Phragmites australis in Chesapeake Bay tidal wetlands. She's been a faculty member at Utah State University since 2008, and currently her research efforts focus on the ecology, genetics, and management of wetland invaders, to the seed ecology of native wetland plants with implications for wetland revegetation, and 3, restoration genetics for sustainable functioning wetland restorations. So take it away, Karin. Thank you for giving us some of your time.
Thank you. That was a lot. I gave you a lot of jargon there, but I'll try to avoid that in my talk. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully I've been doing this all day, sharing the wrong screen. So can you see the full slides?
Yeah.
Hopefully. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Oh, okay, great, because I also can't see your faces now that I have my slides up. So, yeah, I'm going to talk to you about invasive plants of Great Salt Lake wetlands. And as Jamie mentioned, I'm a professor at Utah State University. I'm in the Quinney College of Natural Resources, and I also have an appointment in the Ecology Center. And I'm going to be talking to you about some of our research efforts as well as our manager scientist collaborations, and you can see some fun pictures here from over the years through my time at Utah State University. So I'm going to be focusing on some of the aspects of this book chapter in this great book that Bonnie and Jamie edited. And so we were specifically in charge of invasive plants of Great Salt Lake wetlands, chapter 13. And I'll also mention that Becca Downard and Keith Hambrecht, 2 of my co-authors on this book chapter, are panelists tonight. So it will be really helpful to have their insights as well during the Q&A. So some of the other co-authors, Chad Cranny got his master's degree in my lab, but he manages Salt Creek and public shooting grounds. Becca's at Utah Division of Water Quality. And has worked with me both. I was on her committee as a master's student, and she was in my lab for her PhD. Keith Hambrecht has never been my student, but we've collaborated a lot. He's the only non-Utah State University student on here. I believe he went to the U. Emily Tarsa is a PhD student with me. Diane Manuz got her master's degree in my lab, but works for Utah Geological Survey. And Christine Rohal got her PhD in my lab and now is a postdoctoral researcher at University of Florida. So just a super fun project working with all these great people. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about wetland invaders. Who are they? And what's the big deal with invasive species anyway? And what can be done without them? So specifically, or what can be done about them, specifically focusing on Great Salt Lake. So obviously Phragmites australis, or common reed, gets a lot of attention, and I will speak quite a bit about that this evening. And it gets all the press because it's the most widespread invasive plant that we have in wetlands in Utah, and frankly across North America. It's extremely problematic. That's why I was working on it in Maryland. And when I came to Utah, I realized, wow, I've got some job security here. There's a very large Phragmites invasion problem. So it also gets a lot of press because there's a lot of money being invested in managing this plant. However, I do want to just mention that there are a number of notable other invasive species that I'll just touch on now. I'm not going to spend a lot of time speaking about them tonight, but I want to make you aware of some of these other plants. So purple loosestrife, Lithrum salicaria, is a beautiful plant. It actually was part of the reason it's become invasive is because it was planted in people's gardens. One single plant can produce 2.7 million seeds, so it can really spread quite readily. A more recent invader that we featured in this book chapter is European sea heath, Frankenia pulverulenta. Say that fast a few times. White top you might have seen along roadsides. Cardaria dreba is a noxious weed in Utah. And it looks somewhat similar to perennial pepperweed, Lepidium latifolium. This plant its roots have been found up to 3 meters in the soil, deep down in the soil. That's insane. Cattails are kind of interesting. Typha domingensis and latifolia, they're actually native here to this region, but they're considered invasive. So this is a good time to perhaps define non-native versus invasive. Non-native means it just isn't from here, but invasive plants are plants that are aggressive and tend to take over and form huge stands. So you can see that, for instance, in that picture with perennial pepperweed, that vast expanse of that one plant. So that's considered invasive just because it takes over and not a lot else can persist with it. And just on a side note too, with non-native species, in one recent survey, 70 non-native plant species were documented in or near Great Salt Lake wetlands. So there's a lot of non-native plants out there, but not all of them become invasive or really problematic is how I like to think about it. So what is the big deal? What is lost with widespread plant invasions? Well, I think probably everybody here recognizes the importance of Great Salt Lake and Great Salt Lake wetlands as part of this vast ecosystem. And we have an oasis in the desert. This aerial photo on the bottom there shows how much brown there is in this landscape versus the green of Great Salt Lake really pops out there. And because it's an oasis, it supports more than 130 water bird species, either resident or migratory birds that are moving along the Central and Pacific flyways. And it's because we have this diversity of habitats and abundant resources. They're just essential to fuel birds on these migrations. So that map on the left-hand side there, this really nice map that Becca put together, you can see the different colors show the different types of wetlands. Those playa and mudflat wetlands particularly along the fringe of, or the shorelines of Great Salt Lake, like we were just hearing about. Open water wetlands in that darker blue up by the Bear River Refuge in particular and Harold Crane. We've got emergent wetlands in that darker green, and the pink is meadow wetlands. So really a diversity of wetland habitat types. And then of course birds are using the lake itself, as we all know. So again, thinking about what is lost potentially with invasive species, when we lose these habitats, we're not able to support these incredible bird species. And this is just a snapshot of some of the how important Great Salt Lake and its wetlands are to a wide array of bird species. As one example, American avocet, we have some of the highest counts of this bird in the world at 250,000. Blackneck stilts, we again have some of the highest counts in the world at 65,000. Marble godwits shown there in that D panel. We have the only interior staging area for this species in the western North America. Snowy plovers, these beautiful, delicate little birds, cinnamon teals, green-winged teals. This habitat is essential for them. Moving around on the other side, redheads, northern shovelers, again providing essential habitat. Tundra swans, we have 75% of the western population staging and fueling along Great Salt Lake during the fall migration. And Wilson's phalarope, we have the largest staging population. So I'm not a bird person, but I just find this diversity of species just striking. And so the concerns are, again, as we're losing habitat, that we're really impacting at a continental scale these different bird species. And I also just want to note that these photos were taken by Mia McPherson from On the Wing Photography. She was gracious enough to allow us to use these photos in our book chapter. So she's an amazing photographer. So in addition to bird impacts directly, we need to also consider the economic and cultural impacts of invasive plants. And just a few examples here. We know that bird watching and other non-consumptive uses are, well, one, important for our well-being, our livelihoods, but also have economic contributions locally to the Salt Lake City economy. There's one study that estimated that $50 million annually resulted from these non-consumptive uses of these wetlands and the lake. There's also really important cultural events like the Great Salt Lake Bird Festival, as some of you may have attended. And then, of course, waterfowl hunting is a part of our culture and a part of our history, and contributes $100 million annually to our economy. So with that, I want you to also be thinking about plants, what plants are lost. So I talked about the fact that millions of birds are visiting these Great Salt Lake and associated wetlands each year. And they're dependent on these unique habitats for food, nesting, shelter, loafing, brood rearing, and so forth. So we're losing plant communities, brackish emergent wetlands, playas, meadows, fresh open water areas and these native plants that dominate there. So I have just some common names of these plant species. I noticed in one of the Q&A somebody was asking for Latin names, and I'm happy to share that at a later point. It's all in the book chapter, but some of the key species are hardstem bulrush, three-square and alkali bulrush on that top panel there, saltgrass and pickleweed, and sago pondweed, that's a submerged species, mountain rush in panel G there, and on the bottom row there, moving left to right, common spike rush, nodding beggar tick, and rayless alkali aster, fringed willow herb, some really important species for our native habitats and restoration. So with that, Jamie, is there an issue with the slides I see in the Q&A there?
I'm not sure. I can see everything good. Are other people having trouble seeing the entire screen?
This is Bonnie. I'm not having any trouble, but I don't know if anyone out there, if you could put in the chat box if you are having trouble. It looked like Cindy was having trouble.
Huh.
Cindy can't see all slides, but I don't know if no means no problems or no means it's not working.
No problem, says Preston or Margie.
Or Rosalie. Okay.
Okay, Rosalie. Margie has no problem, so Rosalie.
Cindy, Lynn says choose to fit window under view options. Oh.
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to keep going here if we're good to go.
Yeah, thank you.
No, it looks fine on your end, but maybe if viewers are having trouble, they can listen to Lynn's response, choose to fit window under view options. Maybe they need to select a different view option. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to get back to our main attraction and talk about Phragmites, largely because this is where a lot of our research efforts have been. So a little background about Phragmites in Utah. This plant was introduced from Eurasia, and as I mentioned earlier, it's found throughout much of North America in wetlands and disturbed habitats. And well, it's a very aggressive plant. You can see, so there's Chad Cranny. He is not a short person. He is quite tall, at 6.5 feet tall, and this plant is towering above him. You can see the track from the Marshmaster there, and you can see just the sheer amount of biomass. But interestingly, Phragmites is a cryptic invader. There is a native subspecies. It's not found really along Great Salt Lake now at all. There's one spot along Utah Lake where I know it has been in the past. But it's in more remote areas in southern Utah in particular. So back to non-native invasive Phragmites. The first record of it was in 1993 in herbarium records, but it probably was around since the 80s based on conversations I've had with a number of people. And how much do we have? Well, one estimate in 2011 from work by my student Lexine, we estimated we had about 93 square kilometers on Great Salt Lake. It's not clear exactly how much we have now. We still have a lot. Conveniently, though, Utah Department of Ag and Food classified it as a Class 3 containment species in terms of noxious weeds. So there is some additional funding for controlling it and legal motivation for that. Nonetheless, we're still spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on control. But I must say that DWR and Forestry Fire State Lands and many of the other managers have made incredible progress in terms of controlling this species. So what specifically is the problem with Phragmites? It is, again, poor habitat. It crowds out other native plants. As you saw, just how dense it gets. It's physically impossible to move through, and it's replacing native species that are important food sources. In that picture in the lower left, you can see saltgrass and alkali bulrush seeds, and those are two important species, food source species. In addition, it impedes recreation and views and site access. So here's a picture from near Saratoga Springs, and some folks thought that they'd bought lakefront property, yet they cannot get to the lake because that is all solid Phragmites. That's Utah Lake, but it's a similar issue in other parts of North America. So not only a problem for wildlife, but also for people. And related to that, it really is a fire hazard and a potential impact to air quality. There have been a number of arson wildfires where the fire just escapes and hundreds of acres are burned. And we do use burning for controlling Phragmites, but often that's done when the air quality, that they have great restrictions on when that can happen to ensure that we don't negatively impact air quality. It's also a thirsty plant. We obviously live in a dry place, and so because it is so prolific and produces so much biomass, it's transpiring a lot of water, so there's concerns about those impacts. I want to talk a little bit about how it spreads. So when I'm going to be transitioning here to talk about some of the research we've done since I started at Utah State in 2008. One of the first things we wanted to figure out is what are the mechanisms of its spread. We know that it can spread by seeds. You can see those pictures in the upper right, in the 4 panel there on the left-hand side of that four picture panel. And on the right-hand side of that panel, you can see spread by stolons, which are stems above ground, as well as rhizomes, which are stems below ground. But we did some genetic work early on to figure out what the relative contribution was of spread by seeds versus spread asexually by rhizomes and stolons. And our work showed that actually most of the spread is by seeds. It's really spreading far and wide. And that really had implications for how people approach management. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But in terms of thinking about numbers, one thing I want you to be thinking about is one inflorescence, those flower heads, can produce somewhere between 1,500 to 3,000 seeds, just one single flower head. So if you look at that picture in the lower right there, where there are tens of thousands of flowering heads, you can imagine that this plant has what we call very high propagule pressure, propagules being those seeds. Just the amount of seeds blanketing the landscape is really astronomical. So let's talk about what can be done about it in terms of management and the role of my research group. So when I started my research program at Utah State, I wanted to get a sense of what managers' needs were and initiate collaborations. So this is my scientific perspective on things. We had questions about how is Phragmites currently managed? What are the big questions that managers had? Again, this is back in 2008, 2009. How do they approach revegetation, seeding and planting? And how can we facilitate collaborations between scientists and managers? So one of the things that we did early on to address these questions was to survey wetland managers. So you can see our not super fancy survey on the right-hand side there. Things have come a long way in the last 12 years. And some of the things that we found from our early surveys were that the most common way that people were controlling Phragmites was spraying it in the fall with glyphosate. It's the same chemical that's in Roundup that people use in their gardens sometimes, but a wetland formulation. But there are questions about the best time to be spraying it, whether this other chemical, Invasive, was better. Could cows be used to graze it? And we also were noting that people were not really revegetating, seeding, or planting. And there were questions about whether that was needed and how to do that. So that really helped set our agenda. And the other thing was that we also, so we want to address these research questions, and we did so by initiating collaborations with many managers. So you can see some of the pictures. Some of the folks there, for those of you that have worked on Great Salt Lake, you may recognize a number of people, particularly in the upper right, that have since retired. So this was a while ago, but through the development of these Phragmites management studies, we initiated these collaborations that are still going on today. And some of the key outcomes of really intentionally working with managers from the start is that there is much improved communication among all of us. And we've been able, from our standpoint, it's been fantastic to be able to collaborate for many large-scale joint studies where we're looking at how to treat invasive plants at very large scales and figuring out what's most cost effective, and we're looking at treatments that managers might actually implement, as opposed to, in academia we sometimes I just saw the comment from Valerie. Yes, Valerie's in that top photo from back in the day. We looked at treatments that were very generally straightforward to implement, as opposed to, when you leave scientists to their own devices, we kind of scheme up things that maybe are not super realistic to implement on the ground. So we embarked on a series of large-scale management studies, and this was the research of Chad Cranny when he was a master's student, and Christine Rohal when she was a Ph.D. researcher in my lab. And we looked at things like the best timing and type of herbicide, how to stop that seed production that I mentioned. And it was really a massive 5-year effort that it was fantastic. It was great. We learned a lot, and it was just a great collaboration. So what exactly did we find? The answers to those questions. So before I jump into the key findings, I'll note that we've summarized this work in this document, How to Restore Phragmites Invaded Wetlands, and this is an extension document that is free and easily available. But some of the key findings were confirming that this fall application that managers had already been doing for a while was better than a summer application of herbicides. So on the East Coast, a lot of people were thinking that summer applications might be better. And there were questions here too about the fact that later in the fall, many of our our plants may be drought stressed, so that herbicide might not work super well. This chemical Invasive that again was emerging on the East Coast is really very effective. Turned out it was not greatly superior to glyphosate, and Invasive is a lot more expensive, so there's generally, in most cases, not a reason to be using it. And we also were able to show that it's important in that first year, if you can get rid of the seeds, those millions and millions of seeds through mowing or grazing, that you can be much more effective in the long term. Optimizing frag management. So what's the long-term prognosis? And, not all management treatments will work across all sites. And what about with patches that are small and contained, like in that picture there, versus vast expanses? So some of the key findings from our research were that there is for sure going to be, this plant is not going anywhere. So thinking about budgeting and effectiveness, long-term control, keeping after those small patches that pop up in the landscape is going to be essential. We did also find that some of the sites that became more dry in the fall the herbicide, basically, you need to have healthy Phragmites to be able to kill it with herbicide. If it's drought stressed, it doesn't take up the herbicide. We also found that native plants, they were generally coming back pretty slowly and quite variably, particularly in those drier sites. And it really depends on what kind of plants are around the area. You know, again, in this picture here, you can see that Phragmites stand, but it's surrounded by a sea of alkali bulrush. So those are places where you'd have more success. In addition to that, we also looked at grazing. And, you know, we're here in Utah, there are a lot of cows, and there were questions about, could we use grazing effectively? But, you know, cows poop in wetlands. Is that a good thing? What might be those water quality impacts? So we embarked on, again, another massive effort. This was Brittany Duncan's master's research. She now works for Utah Department of Ag and Food. And we had these 30-acre research plots across multiple sites at Harold Crane and Howard Slough and Farmington Bay. And this picture on the lower right, I think Becca Dannard took this picture, and you can see the impact of grazing. So the kind of square rectangle perimeter there is actually the fence line. And outside of it, the no treatment area, there's no cattle. But on the inside, you can see where the cattle have lots of paths through the Phragmites and how they're basically breaking down the biomass. So what did we find from this research that Brittany did? We saw that grazing really was showing a lot of desirable outcomes. It's reducing the cover of Phragmites, reducing that biomass, reducing that seed production. And one thing I didn't talk about earlier, but I should have mentioned, is that even when it dies off, it leaves what we call litter, lots of dead plant material. I mean, it could be waist high. It just is, again, impenetrable. So cattle moving through a site can help trample it. From Brittany's research, we found that high intensity grazing for shorter periods of time is really important. You do need to mow some paths for the cattle to just get some access. And obviously it would only be during the growing season. They need to be eating live Phragmites. They're not going to go after dead Phragmites. There are some serious logistical challenges, though. You need to keep those cows contained, so having fencing up, and they need something to drink. One thing that I found that was kind of interesting and somewhat amusing was not all cows can graze in wetlands. So if you bring mountain cows down in the wetlands, their feet rot. You need to have marsh-capable animals, which many of the managers had discovered this through years of working with some of these grazers. I think one of the most important things that Brittany found was that if you draw down your site before you graze and you don't reflood it for at least a couple weeks after the cattle are taken off, the nutrients actually stay within the site and get taken up by the plants that are growing. So we were really concerned about downstream impacts of grazing, but with this short-term high-intensity grazing and lowering water levels, we were able to keep the nutrient effects, or basically limit any sort of negative nutrient effects. Again, we summarize some of this research in this extension document, which is free, and I can post some links for this later. So I just want to summarize from the work from these various students what we have found and where we're headed. And so we have outlined these different treatment cycles, so to speak. On the left-hand side, one option is that to go after that seed production is to first go in and mow or graze to prevent those seeds from being produced, and then come through and spray with herbicide at least a month after mowing or grazing, and doing this for at least 3 years, and then still spot spraying, as DWR and Forestry Fire State Lands have been doing, for years. They know this. They're demonstrating it for all, how important it is. An alternative strategy is to spray in the fall and come through and mow or burn the biomass in the winter time, at least a month after spraying. And again, doing this for at least 3 years. at the bottom there, I say restore native plants. So one of the key findings, which I didn't have much time to talk about today, was that native plants are not coming back very vigorously. And so this is actually where a lot of our research is right now, to how to jumpstart this ecosystem to get it back to that important habitat through seeding or planting. The other thing that really was extremely important was how working together across this whole ecosystem was so essential, and being coordinating management. And we see a lot of great cooperation among landowners, and I say diverse landowners. This map on the right hand side, those different colors show the different types of wetlands: federal, nonprofit, private, state wetlands. And it really requires shared goals around invasive Phragmites, open lines of communication, and commitment to action. And it's been really inspiring to see all that folks have been doing for more than 10 years, as you know, for 15 or 20 years now, collaborating together. And part of it is because if your neighbors are not doing their part with that seed production, you're not going to be able to control Phragmites, because it's just spreading around so much by seed. So with that, I would just like to say thanks to all the fantastic people in the Great Salt Lake and Great Salt Lake wetland community who've made all of this research possible, and the fun collaborations that we've had over the years. And I will be happy to take any questions with my other panelists here. So thank you.